One of the domains that, or the fields that Innovate wants to speak into and facilitate is the domain of politics. Now, there's a lot of argument in politics about how the church should be involved, or if the church should be involved, in the whole unfortunate, separation of church and state thing, and therefore the church should have no place. Well, I don't believe that the church should run the government, and that's what should be meant by church and state. But as citizens, the church should play its part in the community and so seek to influence. In fact, I would go further as a pastor and say that for me the church is the prophetic conscience of the community, because God's speaking through the church to the people. So now in that light, when I was at university, I studied politics, and it was really either left or right and nothing much in between. And there weren't any real great resources for Christians entering politics. You had to join a political party if you wanted to do that. In recent years, we've seen the emergence of the Australian Christian lobby, and they're non-partisan. They're not either left or either right. They speak with and for and to all sides of the political persuasion, trying to promote the Christian values in the community, because not everybody thinks in those terms. They like to help government and oppositions or whatever think through the implications of policy in the public space, and what a change in policy might actually bring to the community when you look at it slightly differently other than economically. So I've really appreciated Australian Christian Lobby, and Gateway as a church supports Australian Christian Lobby as a local mission, because we really believe that we need Christians speaking into that public space, into that marketplace in non-partisan ways. We really need that in Australia. So I have invited Australian Christian Lobby's Managing Director, Lyle Shelton, to come, and he's got an extremely busy agenda, but he's made some time for us this afternoon, and then I think he flies back to Canberra tonight. Lyle I've known for a long time now. He has a background in journalism and himself in local politics, so he speaks with some authority. And I just really love Lyle's heart. He's going to be talking to us about maybe some controversial subjects, so I would ask you to do as a lot of Gateway people at least do, and for those of you who are not Gateway, you can jump on board, is to make sure we have a civil discussion about these things. We're not going to solve the problems of the world today, but I have asked Lyle to come and to give his perception of what the issues facing the church are. Whichever side we land on, agreeing or not, is really not the point. I want to empower you to know what the issues are, because we have to understand the times and know what to do. So without further ado, would you give a warm welcome to Lyle Shelton?
Well, thanks very much, Rick, for that warm welcome. It's fantastic to be here at this conference today, and I just love everything that it stands for. And I'm really thrilled that perhaps ACL can claim a little bit of credit in the fact that this conference exists. I know Rick's been thinking deeply about these issues, how to engage culture and society for a long time, being a sociology student from his uni days. But at ACL, we've been grappling for a long time about how do we get the church to be more engaged in politics? How do we get the church activated? We live in a participatory democracy, and that means we, the citizens, have the opportunity to participate. And we often hear this separation of church and state mantra, which Rick's just enunciated. That's being used by people who don't like the church's voice in politics to say we should stay out. But of course that was never the case. We're meant to participate as citizens, and of course people of faith have every right to be part of the democracy. Our politics is influenced by something called public policy. It's public. We're part of the public. Let's engage. So as part of that, we thought, well, how do we get the church to engage more fully? The church is very good at evangelism, building local church, all of that sort of thing. I'm part of a local church. I love seeing people come to Christ. But I also think part of the gospel is taking Christian values into every sphere of society. And so to try and address that, a few years ago at ACL, we thought, well, let's try and help pastors perhaps see a bigger picture from Scripture, from history, from our heritage as a church going back 2,000 years to the church fathers and what the church has had to say down through the millennia. And let's introduce some of that to pastors to help them perhaps see that this is core business of the gospel. And Rick was kind enough to come up to the first of the pastors' courses that we ran about 2 years ago, and then as a result of that started this conference. So you're here today because Rick went to went to ACL a couple of years ago. But as Rick said, we are non-party partisan. We're not a political party. Sometimes people ring us up and say, can we vote for your candidate? So we said, no, that's not us. We encourage Christians to join the political party of their choice. And our desire is to see Christian values affect the policy platforms of the major parties on the left and the right. And we believe that Christians in good conscience can vote on either side of the spectrum. And there's aspects of Christian values and worldview on the left as there are on the right. And I don't think Jesus is either left or right. Our vision is to see Christian principles and ethics influencing the way we are governed, do business, and relate to each other as a community. Our strategy, we have a team of government relations experts or professionals around the nation. Dan Flynn, who I'll introduce you to in a moment, is our Victorian director. He works into the Victorian Parliament. I'm sure many of you know Dan. We have similar people working in each of the states except for South Australia. And then there's myself and my Chief of Staff, Martin Isles, who work into the Federal Parliament in Canberra. We're supported by a small research and communications and admin team that supports the organisation nationally in our Canberra headquarters. We believe that elections are key times, so you'll often see us active during elections. Dan engaged the Premier and the Opposition Leader prior to the last election for a Make It Count event, and that was extremely profitable. We saw some commitments come out of both leaders, and it shows that the Christian constituency has a view on public policy, and those are quite impactful. We also believe very much in leadership development. I talked about the pastor's course, but one of the things we've started in the last 3 or 4 years is the Lachlan Macquarie internship. And we take young people who have got a desire for politics or public policy away for 14 weeks in a live-in situation. By a miracle of God's grace, we've purchased a property half an hour outside of Canberra on 20 acres with beautiful residential facilities. And in fact, the graduation of the latest course is on today. I'm sad to be missing it, where 7 interns have graduated from the latest course. And already we're seeing that have an impact as young people then go into the political party of their choice and get involved at staff level or as members of the party with a view to having influence there in the future. Well, you might have seen on the first slide that was up, I want to talk about 5 big issues that are affecting public policy that we as Christians should be interested in. And I'm going to spend a disproportionate amount of the time on this issue of marriage today. I'm sure you've seen the news over the last week or so. It's been a big issue, and it's a difficult one. It's controversial, as Rick said, and it's one that we want to be sensitive to as Christians because this involves deeply held feelings of people. There's genuine pastoral issues that we would see from a Christian perspective. And I want to say right from the start that ACL, as an organisation that has been involved in this public debate for many years now, we bear no animus to any people or persons. We don't hate, we love, but we do want to be involved in a public debate because this is about public policy, and we should be able to put a view without being labelled as bigots or as homophobes or some of these terrible pejorative terms that are thrown around. I think we've got to be bigger than that and be able to have a civil discourse, and that doesn't mean that by participating in that debate that we bear any animus to anyone. I'd like to just show a 7-minute video, and I'm not... it's of an interview that I did recently with Peter Van Onselen from Sky News. Peter Van Onselen is one of Australia's best known and he's a well-respected political commentator. He writes for The Australian and he has his own show on Sky News. And back in March he interviewed me on this issue, and I'd like to show it, not to showcase anything of myself necessarily, but I hope it will just give us an idea of how we as Christians can participate in this discussion in a rational way. So If the guys at the tech desk would like to roll
Right,
that.
as I mentioned, the head of the Australian Christian Lobby joins me now live. Lyle Shelton. Sorry, mate. I almost fumbled.
That's
I
right,
did fumble your last name. Thanks very much for being there. I want to start by asking you, if I can, I want to talk about the broader issue of gay marriage and your obvious lobbying against it. But you guys put out a press release the other day, which seemed to suggest, it got a few of us journalists wondering what was going on, seemed to suggest that the Liberal Party room had made a call on this, that they were going to continue to put in place a binding vote, but they didn't actually discuss it. I just wondered if you could just bring us up to date on what that was all about.
Yeah, sure, Peter. I think anyone who was watching politics last week could see there was a pretty strong push on to pressure the Liberal Party to cave in and to grant a conscience vote on same-sex marriage. And that was certainly the Libertarian Senator David Leyonhjelm's expectation.
Yep, absolutely.
The Gay Lobby organised a very big email campaign, and we felt that we needed to take action as well, and we encouraged our people to email. And as a result of that, the issue wasn't even raised in the party room, and that means that the Liberals have held the line, and we wanted to make sure our supporters were aware of that.
Oh, okay, sorry, because I thought maybe they had discussed it and decided to hold the line, but your point was more that it hasn't even been raised, so status quo prevails, I guess.
Correct, and as a result of 20,000 Australians speaking up.
But you know it will come up, because there will be a point, there's enough Liberals, people from Simon Birmingham to Kelly O'Dwyer, maybe not a majority, by the way, in the Liberal Party room. In fact, I'd suggest an overwhelming majority in the Liberal Party room probably agree with your position on this. But you would think that there will be a debate about whether it should go to a conscience vote nonetheless. And there is the risk there that even people that strongly support your side of the debate still think that it should go to a conscience vote just to allow it to be a free vote. What do you say to them?
Well, that may be the case, Peter, and this may come back, may or may not come up again. But our concern is that we believe a political party that is there to enact public policy in the best interests of the child should always vote as one on an issue as critical as marriage. If we change the definition of marriage, what we're saying is that we're legislating a situation where children are required to forfeit either their mum or their dad, and that's an issue of social justice, and that's something we think shouldn't happen, and a party is quite appropriate to have a policy position on it.
Can I ask you for a strategic position on this? Because look, I'm on the record as being in favour of gay marriage, but I respect your right to disagree with me. I'm not here to have an argument about it. I suspect we will never see eye to eye on this issue. But let me ask you the strategic side of things. My read of it would be that if this went to a vote at the moment in the Parliament as a free vote, that your side of the argument would win, not mine. What about the strategy of allowing that to get the vote done? Because if you have the vote now, just like the Republic, for example, it means that it's probably much longer into the distance before my side of the debate have a chance to have the vote again. But if you stifle it with party positioning, it's probably going to come to a conscience vote sooner when that party position changes. It might take a couple of years, but when it does, you're more likely to lose the vote. Do you see what I mean? From a conservative perspective, I think you're probably better off to have the vote now and win it rather than delay the vote, but then more likely lose it in a sooner subsequent vote.
I think the problem with that, Peter, is we obviously live in a democracy, and the lobby that's wanting to redefine marriage, they will obviously go after people on an individual basis. But I think there's a higher principle here. I think a political party shouldn't give up on something as important as marriage. It is appropriate that the party has a party position, and I don't want to concede that point at all. The party room may take a different view in the future, but I want to make the case that this is a social justice issue for children. And if we redefine marriage, and I hope people like you can be convinced that redefining marriage means redefining family, and it means legislating a family structure which causes and requires a child to miss out on a mother or father. And I think we need to hear some of the voices in this debate who are starting to come forward, people who have been raised by same-sex parents who obviously love them, but like Heather Barwick writing in News Corp last week said she had every day a hole in her life and an ache in her heart because of the absence of a father. Now I think we've got to listen to those voices and realise there's consequences to redefining marriage.
But hasn't the ship already sailed on that issue vis-a-vis children to some extent? Because you've got things like IVF and the capacity certainly for lesbian couples to be able to have children already. Now, whether you think that they do or don't make good parents, the whole denying or allowing gay marriage through, in a sense, doesn't impact on that, does it?
Well, this is still a debate that's happening, Peter. Not all states in Australia have open slather surrogacy. I think there's a big ethical discussion going on in our community and in fact globally about the ethics of assisted reproductive technology and just what that's opening up. So I think we need a more mature debate on this. It doesn't mean that same-sex couples can't love a child. Of course they can. But I think we've got to look at the ethics of whether it's right or not to, as a result of government policy, deprive a child of that most primal bond, and that's the link between the mother and the child, or the link between the father and the child. And I think a civil society will do whatever it can through public policy to look after the most vulnerable, which are our children, and that means public policy which gives them the best opportunity to be raised by their parents. That's what's denied by same-sex marriage ideology.
All right, just one final question, back to the specific issue of gay marriage, for or against. What about this? This is my idea. Hear me out on this. I absolutely, as a Christian organisation, any particular religion, I respect that religion's right to only marry whom they choose to. I believe that the law having a deliberate exemption from discrimination provisions for that is what you have to do for religious organisations. But what about this? What about removing marriage from the state so it's no longer a legal construct? We all get civilly unioned. Civil union is something that has already been looked at. We all get civilly unioned. Marriage is a nomenclature that can only be handed down by specific churches, and those specific churches can make the decision about who they do and don't marry. So some, it's pejorative to say this, I don't mean it that way, but some progressive churches or radical churches would be another way to put it, will allow gay marriage, but other more conservative or traditional institutional churches would not. What's wrong with that?
Well, that's obviously a hypothetical, Peter, but I think the problem with that is what we're doing as a society is walking away from marriage being a legal construct. The government has no interest in who you and I love. That's got nothing to do with the government. What the government is concerned about is how we socialise and raise the next generation. And it's necessary for governments to have a role in marriage, not because of who we love, but because of what it brings to the next generation. And the law has an educative effect. It's not just there as some sort of symbolism, it has an educative effect. And it says that we as a society believe that wherever possible, a man should be responsible for his child and a woman should be responsible for a child that's created. And together they should raise that child wherever possible. Now we know because of tragedy and desertion that doesn't always occur, but it is important that the law sends that message. And that's why I think the scenario you're presenting is not adequate for a civil society.
All right, Lyle Shelton from the Australian Christian Lobby. I appreciate your time on PVO News Hour. Thanks for making yourself available.
Pleasure, Peter. Thanks for having us.
Cheers.
So the backstory to that interview was we'd been doing some campaigning, as you could see, with the Liberal Party room. There was a push on to knock over their party position and to make it a free vote, which would have then opened this issue up for a debate in Parliament, and this was back in March. Peter Van Onselen has written some pretty nasty stuff in his columns in The Australian over the years about ACL, and as he said in the interview, he's very much in favour of changing the definition of marriage. So my team and myself, we did a lot of preparation that afternoon before that interview, workshopping the worst case scenario questions and things. When I got there, as you could see, Peter was very fair, and that was probably one of the fairest interviews that we've ever done on this issue in years. And full credit to Peter, and I was very grateful that he gave us that opportunity and was even-handed about it. But since March, this issue has moved very, very rapidly, and you heard Peter say there that we would win if a vote was held at that time. Things have changed a lot since then, and the numbers have narrowed in the Parliament. Last weekend there was a referendum in Ireland. You might have heard about it. 62%. By 62% it was carried. That's not quite the whole story though. It was a voluntary vote, and so if you take into account that 36% of the population voted for it, which meant that 64% either voted against or didn't turn out to vote. And I just can't remember what the voter turnout was. I think it might have been somewhere in the 60s. So it's not quite the overwhelming support that has been trumpeted through the media, with just 36% actually proactively voting for it. Of course, there was a backlash against the Catholic Church in Ireland. They've had horrible sexual abuse issues, far worse than anything that we've heard in Australia, which has also been terrible. And also, the third factor I think there is that young people, particularly all of us, have been influenced by the sexual revolution of the 1960s, and sexual expressionism is now at one of our highest values in society, and anything that gets in the way of sexual expressionism isn't seen as appropriate, and even to the extent that marriage laws aren't seen as appropriate. So we had Ireland on the weekend. By Tuesday of this week, Bill Shorten, the opposition leader, announced in conjunction with Tanya Plibersek, his deputy, that they would be introducing a bill into the Parliament this Monday to change the definition of marriage. And since then we've seen a number of politicians change sides on this issue. Tony Burke, Catholic, senior Labor shadow minister. That was devastating to see that happen. This is a man we thought was a man of principle, but he's changed his mind, and a number of others have. So the numbers are tight. I still believe it's salvageable. I don't believe this is over. And we've been working with people in the Parliament and with churches and grassroots campaigning to make sure we can try and shore this up. And Dan's been doing a lot of work here in Victoria, organising people to go and visit MPs. It's really, really important that at this time we participate in the democracy. Now, a lot of people say to me, what's the big deal about gay marriage? It doesn't affect anyone. It's just about the loving couple. You heard some of the arguments that I mentioned there. But a lot of people say there's no consequences. And certainly the gay lobby say there's no consequences. Even some Christians say there's no consequences. Well, I just want to challenge that idea today. And I'd like to just play another short video. This is a short one, but it'll just give you... And just before you play it, I'll just set this up. This was an interview on the ABC's Insiders program. Most of us are at church on Sunday morning, so I'm sure none of us ever watch it. I generally stream it on Sunday night. And it was an interview between Jenny Macklin, another senior Labor shadow minister, former deputy leader of the Labor Party, and Chris Uhlmann, who was hosting Insiders that Sunday in lieu of Barry Cassidy. And she was being asked about a move by the Labor Party at its conference in July, which will be here in Melbourne, where there's a motion on the books to bind Labor politicians to vote in favour of gay marriage. Now, if that motion is passed at the Labor conference, it means that all Labor parliamentarians will be forced to vote in favour of changing the definition of marriage. And because of Labor Party rules, if they don't, they will be expelled from the party. You're not allowed to cross the floor in the Labor Party. So if you take a principled position on this, you'll be expelled. Now, one Labor senator who I was meeting with in the last couple of weeks said to me that he doesn't care what the party... He said, I came into this parliament with the view that marriage is between a man and a woman. I'll go out of this parliament with that view. And I really take my hat off to that senator. But this is going to make it very difficult. But there's three good reasons why we shouldn't change the definition of marriage. And the first one is to do with freedom issues. And if the guys could play this video, I'll expand on that.
Should people be treated equally? Yes, I think they should. I don't think Australians believe in inequality on the basis of race or gender, and I don't think we should do so on the basis of sexual preference. So that's the principle, and that's why I think it should be a binding issue. But these matters will be debated in the conference. Which way it goes.
You argue that you're arguing that a person who disagrees with you on this is the same as a racist, that they're a bigot.
Well, I'm not calling anybody names. I'm saying
that's the natural extension of what you're saying.
No,
though,
it's
isn't
not. I'm not about to call anybody names.
Okay, I'll let you be the judge. What's the natural extension of what she's saying? I think that I was really chilled when I saw that. Now, we've known this because we see the rhetoric of the gay lobby all the time, and we've been called bigots. You've only got to have a look at my Twitter handle of this week. Effing bigot is something that regularly comes through my... I'm sorry about the language, but to hear a senior politician, now she wouldn't admit to it, but that's the logic of what she's saying. So let's just think, and this is something that hasn't been done a lot in this debate because it's been conducted amongst slogans called equal love and marriage equality. Well, let's unpack that. What does that mean? Well, if the principle that's at stake here is, as Jenny Macklin said, then the logical extension is any of us in this room who will always want to believe that the essential truth of marriage has to do with gender complementarity, then we are the moral equivalents of racists and bigots, as misogynists. Now that's a pretty serious thing to say. So if this has got the force of law behind it, and remember the law has an educative effect in culture, so what does that mean for Christian schools? If a Christian school is teaching children that there is only one true definition of marriage, are they teaching their kids bigotry? Well, according to the law of the land, essentially they are. If anyone thinks that there's not going to be pressure on those of us who believe otherwise, I think that's a very naive view. So there's issues of freedom. On Saturday night, ACL issued a media release in the wake of the Ireland result, and that media release was headed Irish referendum result, a blow for the rights of children, where I enunciated some of the same things that we were talking about in the PVO interview. One of Australia's well-known political commentators, Bernard Keane of Crikey.com, tweeted to his 44,000 followers, same-sex marriage harming children, ? My goodness, you're a nauseating piece of filth, Lyle Shelton, Australian Christian Lobby. Now, if that was just some troll, and I get lots of trolls, I wouldn't have bothered about it, but this is Bernard Keane, well-known political commentator, often on the ABC drum, 44,000 Twitter followers, he tweets that. Where's the civility and the tolerance? Where's my freedom of speech there? As I said, I've copped all week. My Twitter handle has just been receiving abuse for the whole week. It's been unbelievable. I was trending. That's right. On Saturday night, I was trending in Sydney. And I haven't got time to go into all of this, and Dan's going to talk a bit about some of the religious freedom issues in just a few moments. But in America, in the few states where this has been legalised, 37 states of America have same-sex marriage. In 33 of those, it's come through judicial fiat, not through democracy, through judges. Even in California, where the people voted not to have same-sex marriage, that was overruled by a court. This is the extraordinary thing about this agenda. It's not a democratic agenda at all. But in Washington State, when gay marriage was legalised, this beautiful 70-year-old florist, Baronel Stutman, who some of you would have heard about, was sued by the Attorney General. Now, she's no bigot or homophobe. She was serving this gay couple for years. They were her friends. But when they came to her and said, could you do our wedding, she said, look, I'm really sorry, but because of my conscience and my religious beliefs, I'd prefer not to do your wedding. The Attorney General of the state sued her. When same-sex marriage was briefly legal in Canberra in the ACT back in 2013 before the High Court struck it down, I wrote to our Attorney General, Simon Corbell, and said, what would happen to people who provide services to the wedding industry? He wrote back to me and said they would be in breach of the ACT Anti-Discrimination Act. If the definition of marriage changes, anyone who wants to exercise their right of conscience, maybe it's this church, if it had a function centre, and perhaps respectfully said, look, we'd prefer not to help celebrate a same-sex wedding, it's against our deeply held beliefs about marriage, you could well find yourself in breach of anti-discrimination law. The second reason, so the first reason is freedom, the second reason is children, and I talked about some of that there on the PVO interview, but this week there's been a lot of media interest. This week I've had the opportunity to debate the Prime Minister's sister, Christine Forster, on Triple J Hack. Triple J Hack's not exactly friendly territory for the Christian lobby, but nonetheless I was able to articulate some of these arguments and say, well, if we're going to have the benefits of marriage equality flowing, because if you change the definition of marriage to have marriage equality, two men have got to have the benefits of that. How is it then that Australia can logically sustain the prohibition that we have on commercial surrogacy? If there's going to be marriage equality for men, they have to have free access to the ability to have children. And Christine Foster couldn't answer that, and she was sort of, I guess, trying to say that children have nothing to do with the marriage equality debate. So I said to Christine, well, how do two men get babies? And of course, well, they're biological incapable, and they fudged the issue. On Wednesday, I was debating Ivan Teo, the Deputy Director of Australian Marriage Equality, and again, they were trying to say, children have nothing to do with this. And I said, well, the benefits of marriage equality have to flow. And I said, well, Ivan, would you support the current ban on commercial surrogacy? he wouldn't answer the question on air. And on Thursday night I was debating Rodney Croome on ABC Radio National, and similarly I was able to put some of these same arguments. We have to provide unfettered access to sperm donation so that lesbian women can get children. And I don't doubt for a moment that two women or two men can't love a baby. Of course they can. I have no animus towards them. I'm sure they could be great, loving parents to children. But we have to ask a threshold question. Is it right, not through tragedy or desertion, to break the primal bond of a mother and a child, to leave a surrogate mother with milk in her breast but no baby in her arms, with that baby going to two men? If we're comfortable with that as a society, as an appropriate way to deal with vulnerable children who have no say and to sever them from their biological identity, well, that's fine. Let's go ahead with marriage equality and provide its benefits. If we think there's ethical issues associated with that, I think we should try and stop this juggernaut and have a bit more of a think about it. The final reason that I think we should not support changing the definition of marriage is because if you eliminate the gender requirement in the definition, and if the argument and the principle is love and non-discrimination, as Jenny Macklin says, why would you have a numeric limitation on marriage? Why would you? How can you logically sustain an argument if the principles are about love? And we already have Kaiser Trad of the Islamic Friendship Association in Australia publicly saying, this is not secret, this is not some secret agenda, that we should have polygamy. Well, why would you stop it? So I think these are some really important issues that you rarely hear in the debate and which we need to stop and think about. We're on to life, and that last issue about Dr. Mark Hobart is a great segue. So we're talking 5 big issues. We've done marriage, we've done religious freedom. There's many more aspects of religious freedom we could talk about, including some things that happened in Tasmania last week to our advantage. But this life issue is a big one, and I think the issue of human rights for the unborn is probably the biggest social justice issue that faces the Western world, and it almost seems one that's lost. But in the United States, over the last 10 years or so, there's been some stunning gains in this area. Galaxy polls regularly show now a majority of Americans are pro-life. I bet you didn't know that. These are secular polls that are done. This issue of gender selection abortion, which Dan was just talking about, Senator John Madigan from here in Victoria tried to get actually successfully got a Senate inquiry into gender selection abortion last year. Now, because the politics of this are so fraught and emotive in the Parliament, the inquiry has gone nowhere. The recommendations have been dead-ended, and they try and say, well, this is not really happening. Well, look at Dr. Mark Hobart's situation. Of course it's happening more and more, and yet the Parliament will not deal with this issue. It's an outrage. And in an age where we're supposed to be thinking about the well-being of girls and equality and all this sort of thing, we're quite happy to turn a blind eye to the abortion of babies, not because they've got even an abnormality or some sort of disability, but because they're a girl. This is happening in Australia here and now. It's outrageous, and we are silent about it. As I mentioned, there's been some terrific gains in America. Kansas and Oklahoma just this year have both of their state legislatures have passed bills into law banning dismemberment abortion. Now, I'd never heard that term before. I know what the procedures and practices in abortion are, but pretty much from about 12 or 13 weeks to about 20 weeks and beyond, the way a baby is aborted is through dismemberment in the womb. It's quite brutal. Now, there's a lot of scientific research to say that babies feel pain. There's conjecture as to when that kicks in, but certainly dismembership abortion now has been banned in those 2 states. The US House of Representatives just a couple of weeks ago, so this is one of the houses of Congress, passed a law also banning that. Now, it won't get through the US Senate, and it won't get past President Obama's veto pen, but this is incredible progress, and there's barely been a whisper in the media. ACL puts out media releases saying, look, this is happening in the US, perhaps we should consider this here, but I think we got no pickup from that. The media don't want to know about it. But I believe the tide will turn on abortion, and we will see it, but we must continue to raise our voices on behalf of the unborn. Euthanasia continues to be a big issue. There's the Greens rate gay marriage and euthanasia as their two top priorities. I'm not sure what happened to koala bears and trees, but certainly they're their big priorities. And we need to be ever vigilant. ACL has fronted up to every Senate and state parliamentary inquiry over the years on euthanasia. We write submissions, we turn up and give evidence, and keep making the case as to why we shouldn't go down this slippery slope of terminating people's lives prematurely, and that palliative care is the way to go. The fourth issue I want to talk about is the poor and the vulnerable. And ACL's been very engaged and continues to be engaged in these issues as well. The persecution of religious minorities is a big, big issue. The Middle East, the crisis in Syria has seen Christians driven out of ancient homelands, places like Aleppo. Before ISIS came along, Dan and I were involved with the Syrian church community here in Melbourne. We've taken them up into the Commonwealth Parliament to see senior ministers and politicians to advocate for more refugees to come to Australia who are being persecuted simply because of the fact that they're Christians. Suddenly, ISIS rolled into Mosul, into Iraq last year, and suddenly everyone became aware that this was a crisis as Christians had to flee the Nineveh plains where they've lived since the time of the early church. This is religious cleansing on a massive scale going on. There's 1.5 million refugees in Lebanon at the moment. The country can hardly cope with that. And of course, there's plenty in Jordan as well to the south. We've been calling for the Australian government to increase the humanitarian intake. Now, with that scale of displacement of people, it's the worst humanitarian crisis since World War II. A lot of people don't know that in terms of people being displaced. And a large number of those are Christians. There's also Yazidis involved, there's Mandaeans, the followers of John the Baptist, and there's also Shia Muslims who are being persecuted and massacred as well. This is a shocking, shocking crisis. In June last year, I had the privilege of being in Washington, D.C., and I had some spare time, and I went to the Holocaust Museum, which is a very moving thing to do. But there the whole mantra was never again. And that was June last year, at the time when ISIS was rolling across the Nineveh plains, killing Christians and massacring people. And I'm thinking, hang on, here's the world standing by when we said never again. And so our plea to the government has been, please, you've stopped people smuggling. That's a good thing. But that doesn't mean we should stop the refugees. And we've got people suffering here. There should be a waiting on those who are under the most duress. We can't bring everyone to Australia, but we can certainly do a lot more. And 13,700 refugees a year to this country is a pretty poor effort from a country as wealthy as ours. So we've been trying to make the case for that. 20,000 of our supporters last year signed a petition calling on the refugee intake to be increased, and we'll continue arguing for that. In Pakistan, they have these terrible blasphemy laws. There are many people on death row for blaspheming the Prophet Muhammad. There's a woman called Asa Bibi whose crime was to drink a bowl of water out of a village well as a Christian, and that upset some of the local Muslims. They accused her of blaspheming the Prophet. She is now on death row in Pakistan, and her conviction was affirmed by a court in Lahore just before Christmas. And yet we allow the Pakistani cricket team to come here with no comment or any diplomatic pressure being put on Pakistan simply because this woman has allegedly blasphemed the Prophet. The Charlie Hebdo gunners, they killed those journalists in Paris because they blasphemed the Prophet. Who needs terrorists when the state will do the killing for you? And yet the world remains silent. And we were silent when the Pakistani cricket team came here for the World Cup in February. Saudi Arabia, now Saudi Arabia is supposedly a moderate Muslim country. It's not Islamic State, but their education curriculum lists Jews and Christians as enemies. This is in their high school curriculum. And you can check this out through the US Commission on International Religious Freedom. They're a body set up by the US Congress which monitors religious freedom around the world, and their report says this is in Saudi Arabian textbooks. My question is, does this raise or lower the terrorism threat in Australia? And why are we not saying anything as a nation? Because of our concern at ACL for persecuted religious minorities. We put in a proposal to the Australian Labor Party's conference, which, as I said earlier, is here in Melbourne in July, and they have accepted our proposal to run a forum as part of the fringe events that go on at the conference, and we're doing that on persecuted religious minorities with an aim to try and put pressure on both parties to see this humanitarian intake increased, and we're very pleased to be doing that right in that forum. Some of you might have noticed in the recent budget that our overseas aid was cut yet again. Well, actually, the cuts were announced in the last budget and then before Christmas, so the quantum didn't change in the budget. The aid budget had already been gutted, but we saw some of the detail of where those cuts would be applied, and of course we're pretty much moving out of Africa and out of Indonesia. Now, I think, again, as a wealthy country that had made promises during the Howard era as part of the United Nations Millennium Development Goals, that we would increase our aid to 0.7% of gross national income by 2015. We're currently at about 0.2%. We've broken our promises, we've trashed it, we've found it as an easy way to try and deal with our budget deficit. And I just think that's a travesty on a country like Australia. Great Britain, whose economy is much more a basket case than ours, have met their 0.7% commitment, and yet we've failed to meet our promise. I think these are deep ethical issues which the government should be held account. Both sides of politics have been guilty. Labor started deferring aid in their last couple of years in office, and then the coalition came in and cut it. The other issue affecting the poor and the vulnerable, which we think there's many, but it's hard to rank them all, is this issue of poker machines and problem gambling, and ACL's been active for many years in that area. Issue number 5 is sexualisation and objectification of women. Our State Director up in Queensland, Wendy Francis, has a national role on behalf of our organisation in helping advocate for this. She has been very effective in lobbying the Queensland government to change the laws on outdoor advertising. Have you all seen those sexualised billboards that afflict our communities, which our kids have to see as we're driving them to school? She's got in principle commitment that there should be law changes. It's not all there yet, but she's instigated a parliamentary inquiry which recommended that advertisers who breach the advertising standards should have penalties. Now, we've still got a long way to go, but we're making progress. I don't know whether you've heard of Zoo magazine. There's a big campaign going on at the moment about that. What it tells young men to do to try and get women into bed is just absolutely shocking. This was sold at Coles and Woolworths. ACL has been campaigning for internet filtering for some time now. I apologise for this graphic, and I'm not going to read out the tattoo on the young lady's side there, but this was in the Australian this morning, and this is the story is about, it says, unsupervised internet access is spawning a generation of hypersexualised children who are requiring medical treatment for injuries and anxiety as they mimic adult pornography online. We've been campaigning for internet filtering for a long time. The Rudd government promised that there would be filtering and then walked away from it because there was a backlash from civil libertarians and from the internet industry, and it's off the agenda. We have the technology to filter the internet. If adults must have pornography, we can build in systems where they could opt in, but at least let's have a default to protect our kids. If an image like that and a young girl getting a tattoo like that doesn't shock us into doing something, I don't know what will. There is an epidemic of self-esteem and self-harm issues amongst young girls in our communities because of the sexualisation that's going on. It's a huge issue. ACL's been very active in campaigning against state governments who legalise brothels. Victoria was the first state in Australia to legalise brothels back in the 80s. It's been a disaster. It spawned a massive illegal industry alongside the legal industry. Queensland followed suit, New South Wales, ACT. We've stopped the Northern Territory government in the last 12 months from legalising brothels. Both myself and Wendy went up there and lobbied politicians, and Wendy's recently been to South Australia and helped stall and put off a bill that was in the South Australian Parliament just this year. There's a better way. Sweden says brothels are illegal, but it's not illegal to be a prostitute, but it is illegal to purchase a woman for sexual services. That has been incredibly effective in Sweden. to the extent that a number of other countries have adopted that model, Canada being the most recent. And we continue to say to our state parliamentarians, hey, this is ridiculous, you have state-sanctioned exploitation of women here. And of course, legalising brothels hasn't solved the prostitution issue in this country. It's actually made it worse. It's inherently exploitative. So I hope from that you get a little bit of a snapshot of some of the issues that ACL is engaged in. We get a lot of criticism for the work we do on marriage. There's been about 12 or 13 attempts through state, federal and territory parliaments to change marriage. We've been involved in all of those campaigns in the last 3 or 4 years, and it has taken a disproportionate amount of our time. But we do walk and chew gum, and we are very concerned about these other social justice issues as well. We're not a one-issue organisation, unlike our opponents. And I would simply appeal to Christians, and we get a lot of criticism for this, saying, why don't you talk about something else? Well, we do. We do a lot of work on these other issues, on these the persecuted minorities and the poor and the vulnerable. But the house is on fire on this issue of marriage, and we can't ignore it. We need to be involved in that debate. Others are driving this agenda. It's not because we're obsessed, it's because they're obsessed. And our choice is, well, do we just let it happen, or do we try and mount some resistance? And I hope that that all of us can be part of this. And I'll talk a little bit more in the next session. And perhaps Dan and I can take some questions at the end of the next session. So thank you very much for that, and I think it's back to Rick.